Hey everyone, I am back. It's been a couple days since I did the first video, and this is the second one, and basically what I'm trying to do here is give a handful of recommendations with these videos of just different resources that would be helpful with your situation. If you're a growing Christian, you're going to want a handful of these resources. You know, if you're a very curious person who wants to research a lot and study a lot, there's some different resources that would be helpful for you. If you're a young person, you know, a high school student or something like that, there's probably at least one volume you need to get from this. And if you're a pastor, of course, you know, if you have the money, go ahead and get them all. Eventually, you're going to have to use them all or reference them all or look into them all at some point and consider what they have to say. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this part of the two-part series is I'm going to recommend to you all three resources kind of from my tradition specifically, and then one that's kind of a little bit broader than that, and then another one that's a little bit broader than that, and then another a series of books, and I've got a couple to share with you that kind of is across the board kind of helpful in just general, no matter what your Protestant background might be, okay? So remember, these are books. These are not, these don't take the place of building character. They don't take the place of your prayer life. They don't take the place of reading the Bible. They don't take the place of going to church. Those are things that we are not just commanded to do, but that's where we find life with Jesus Christ and through the power of His Spirit. And we have to remember that. And this is as much for me as it is for you, okay? It's just easier to do what we like to do instead of what we need to do. And as much as I like to do these things, I know that they don't give me life except for the life that the Spirit brings through the finished work of Jesus, okay? And we want to experience that in this church. So these are resources to experience God's life in that setting, with His people, hearing His word, through the power of the Spirit, in step with Jesus Christ, okay? So I'm going to start with my tradition, and there are three books that I would recommend to you. The first is really the furthest back. This is from, early to mid to late 19th century, Southern Presbyterian. B.B. Warfield called him the greatest American theologian that to the date of his life, which was, early 20th century, basically. And he's right. I've read a lot of sections of this book, and once you kind of get the flavoring of his writing, you're like, man, this guy's good. It's very helpful. It's again, one of the great Protestant theologians in America. And it's a very accessible book in the sense of you can find it with Banner of Truth. You can find it on eBay, and it's still in print today. And I would, if you're a pastor or someone who really wants to grow a library of good books, I would recommend Robert Louis Dabney to you. His Systematic Theology. It's one volume. It's about 900 pages. But don't let that deter you. Just remember, these books are not meant to be read cover to cover all the time. Use them as references. If there's a section that would be helpful for you to read, he's got lectures from his class notes on anything you'd want to know to learn about. I like how fair he is. He comes from his tradition and he's comparing it to his tradition like any good thinker will. But he's fair. He doesn't make jump conclusions. He's a very careful thinker. And while he is more in the rational tradition than maybe we would want him to be, he really does a great job of sticking to not just the historical doctrines, but historical Reformed Presbyterianism, which focuses a lot on the covenant of God. That is a mirror of the covenant that God made with himself in eternity. So he's really working from that. Again, we have a little bit of issue maybe with the way that he is a little bit more rationalistic. He always seems to focus more on the reason than the revelation first. And there's a little bit of a problem with that, I think, is that he always kind of builds his argument, then gets to the revelation. We need to be careful kind of deducing things like that because then it leads us to a little bit of a Platonic way of thinking. And again, there's probably been tons of ink spilled on explaining the difference there. But basically, we need to understand revelation trumps reason, okay? And, I think there's a time for us to use reason to talk to secular audiences, to talk about how reasonable the faith of our history is, and how the faith is reasonable in its explanations. But we don't rest our faith in reason. We rest our faith in Jesus Christ. Even in the almost the conflict at times of faith and doubt. We would call it a paradox, right? Not a contradiction, right? So I love Dabney. I really do. And again, be careful with Dabney. He lived in the South during the Civil War, pre-Civil War and after. He is going to be a different thinker in a lot of ways because of his context. And he's going to have a lot of warts in some areas because of just his context and the times that he lived in, okay? Again, we need to be careful just to simplify everyone's thought based upon something that's clearly off, right? We just need to. We're like that too. We could find one or two things in a day that we're off on that doesn't cancel our existence, okay? We got to be careful with that kind of thinking. It's very self-righteous, okay? So we read Dabney with caution, knowing that he has a context that is problematic, okay? However, I think a fair reading of him would be to make sure that we understand him as a person, his situation, like any other person in life. We need to understand, listen to them first before we judge, okay? So still, great thinker, lots to learn. In fact, his last section on judgment and hell has been actually one of the more encouraging reads I've had in that doctrine ever. He's really good on it. He calls God from the throne for the Christian the great friend, the almighty friend on the throne. You know, when we think about all of our anxiety of judgment, all these things that are going to happen, it's going to be happening for every one of us. It says that once we see the almighty friend on the throne, our fears will dissipate. It's like, wow. There's just so many good things that he has to say. So again, we read him with caution, but still very helpful and really important for the Southern Presbyterian tradition. The second one, very contemporary, just came out. And this one has to do with, it's Presbyterian, but it's really more of what I would call a more traditional biblical systematic theology, where it's really focusing less maybe on proof texts and really trying to do a little bit more work with the scripture. It's also a very easy to follow book. Does not mean that the content is easy to read. It's still systematic theology. It's not devotional literature. It's still challenging to read, but it's so well done that you can follow along pretty well. I just bought this book for my brother a month ago, and he said that he's loving it. I bought it from a student in our senior high, and he and I have enjoyed going through it. Like, this is a good, helpful book for any Christian that's wanting to grow. So it's the book called Systematic Theology by Robert Letham. About 925, 30 pages, still big boy, but not a multi-volume work or anything like that. It's going to focus a lot on the covenant of grace, of course, as a Presbyterian. He's going to talk about God's law as sanctification, right, as a Presbyterian typically does. But he does a really good job on the attributes of God, where he doesn't get so immersed in that discussion that it becomes almost philosophically oriented, right? He does a great job of talking through the doctrines, the attributes of God, engaging the historical controversies, and then moving on and showing the doctrine of God in its perfections, in its biblical ramifications, in its foundations, in its historical setting. But he doesn't get lost in it, which I think some writers do, and then that attributes of God thing becomes almost God itself. And so God becomes more of its attributes than the tripersonal Trinity. So I really like Letham's take on this, and it's very, very well put together. And the book is just beautiful. Crossway does such a good job putting their books together. And if you're someone who likes books, like, you're going to appreciate that. If you don't care, like, not a big deal. But this is a very helpful book when it comes to just the way it's outlined, laid out, and it's reasonably argued. And it's a little bit more engaging the scriptures, which I think will be helpful if you're coming from a more conservative, evangelical-ish kind of background, okay? So that's the second one. The third one is a reprint it's kind of been dressed up a little differently in recent times. But I have found this writer so challenging to read. So this is helpful for me. And I think it'd be a lot helpful for you. And I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to make this writer more accessible to the general public, given how profoundly important he is to the Reformed tradition. And so this book's a little bit broader than the Presbyterian tradition because it comes from the Dutch Reformed tradition. So it's a little bit more continental and ecumenical, and it's a little broader. than the Presbyterian denomination, right? But it's also a more accessible version of this writer. So it used to be called Our Reasonable Faith by Herman Bavinck, and in recent years it has been redressed as The Wonderful Works of God by Herman Bavinck. And look, it's not that long. It's, I think, 400. Nope, right at 500 pages. It's a shorter book. It's a distillation of his 4-volume Church Dogmatics, Reformed Dogmatics, that was released by Baker Academic a number of years ago. That was translated by John Bolt and the great scholars from Calvin College and Calvin Seminary. And as helpful as those books are, for a pastor, you just don't have the time to really meditate through all that unless that's all you're doing and all you're referencing. You know, some pastors do, but if you're like me, you need something that's a little quicker to get through kind of his arguments. And if you have a sabbatical or something, you could probably go through that, but there's just not as much time to always go through a 4-volume thing. You just don't. I like 1 volumes better. They're more accessible. I can get to the point quicker. They're more useful for me in my job and also as a Christian for just time management, okay? So I would really recommend, if you want to know more about Herman Bavinck, this is the best version of his thinking out there. And it's more accessible, it's more immediate in understanding what he thinks. This is not an abridgment of his 4-volume. It's a distillation of basically what he's saying. So I would encourage you to get that if you're looking. I think I got this for $30 from Westminster Press online, and it was a reprint. So, get them while they last, okay? All right, going a little bit broader here. I mentioned this one in I think it was my library discussion. This is a broader work than Bavinck, than Dabney for sure, and then Letham. This is a little broader in the sense of this work is really kind of talking more about the Reformed view, kind of more from a bigger umbrella. I think this one is a little bit better than Concise Reformed Dogmatics, even though that is a great book. I really like that one because it really goes through the Dutch Reformed perspective, but it really kind of, it's more simplistic. It just says, here's the doctrine, here's what the Reformed Church has taught, here's what the Catholics think, here's what the Lutherans think, here's what Barth thinks, here's what Berkhauer thinks, here's what Bavinck thinks, here's what Kuyper thinks, and then it moves on. And it's kind of like that the whole time. It's really good because if you want to know that tradition, it's super helpful. And so I like that. So I've got that one up in my office, and I read through that one really at least like a little bit once a week, and I love it. It's so helpful. And again, that's just like the title says, it's concise. It's helpful for pastors and for people that are wanting to grow. This book is a little bit more dense in that it's trying to engage more modern thinking. So it takes more into account Jürgen Moltmann and Rudolf Pannenberg and Rudolf Bultmann and Wolfhart Pannenberg, and it really takes the modern theology a lot more seriously and engages more ecumenically with it. So that's why I think they called it an introduction to Christian dogmatics, even though it's written by 2 Dutch Reformed theologians. So they're kind of thinking more broadly. I have loved this book. It's just been so illuminating, and it's so nice to know what the modern take is on some of these things without having to try to rummage through Jürgen Moltmann's 9 volumes of systematic treatises or Wolfhart Pannenberg's 3 volumes. It's no replacement for reading those, but it's really helpful to just see the side-by-side comparisons and to kind of work through those with a historic take and a modern take side by side. Not super good on exegetical theology. Doesn't really do a lot of work on the biblical rationale. It does proof text and stuff, but it doesn't work from a biblical way up in that sense. Okay, but that's why it's more of a dogmatics. Okay, so Christian dogmatics, an introduction, by Cornelius van der Kooi and Van den Brink, and these guys are very, very good. Well published, well respected. If you're getting published as a Dutch thinker in America, obviously you've got something that's really helpful to say. So very, very good book. And again, this one's a shorter one as well. 600, I think it's about 700. Yeah, it's about 750. But Erdmann's is so awesome. I love Erdmann's printing. Easy to follow, super helpful. Couldn't recommend this version high enough if you want to know more of an ecumenical kind of Protestant Reformed take and engagement. This is probably more helpful for someone who's very discerning, pastors, people that are a little bit more, need a little bit more scholarly background to work through. Okay? Two more. First one is the Reformed tradition, which is something I'm a part of, a little blip on the radar for me as a conservative Presbyterian. But basically, we have a lot in common with Baptists. Okay, we actually have a decent amount in common with Baptists. We have a lot of similarity in just convictions, and while there are differences in mode of baptism and ecclesiology and a handful of issues on church and state, we're closer than people think. People want to make such a big deal about, oh, look how different they are in the mode of baptism. So is everyone else on their denominational views. Like, it's not just Baptists and Presbyterians. There's a little bit of interplay with that because we are actually fairly close on a lot of areas. And in fact, the Second London Confession of 1689 really takes a lot from the Westminster Confession of Faith. So there's a lot of English Puritanism in both traditions. So that's why there's a little bit of a bickering kind of thing, because there's so much similarity. So I don't concern myself quite as much with Baptists in the sense of knowing every little jot and tittle about what's going on in their theology, because we're closer in a lot of ways. So I'm more interested in the Lutherans. I really like knowing what Lutherans have to say as part of our family of Christian history and Christian thought, and I find them fascinating. My favorite one, and there's a lot of good ones, right? Wolfhart Pannenberg is the most recent. That's acclaimed, but this one's been really good, and I've been wanting it for a very long time, and it just recently finally went on sale where I could actually afford it. It used to be $40 a clip for each book, and then it went on sale for $15 a clip. So this has been helpful. As soon as I got it, I cracked it open, looked at it. It is excellent. It's old, right? It's from the 30s. I think it's the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I think it's actually from the 20s and 30s, or the teens through the 30s when it was written, and then it got translated in the 50s and 60s. I mean, German language, so it took translation. But it's Francis Pieper's Christian Dogmatics. And this guy's great. And this is just the first volume, coming in at I think about it's got 500 pages, man. So 500 pages, and it's 4 volumes. So it's not as accessible because of how long it is. But if you want to know what Lutherans really think, this is a conservative Lutheran, very conservative. Maybe about as conservative as it gets, which is great. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But if you want to know what Lutherans have to say, they don't hold the punches with the Reformed and the Calvinists. They really let us have it. There's some pejorative character there, but it's to be expected. I love to see what he has to say about Reformed thinkers and the Calvinist tradition. It's really nice to see just really where they find the differences and where they find their distinctiveness. So it's very good. It's typically lauded very well by Lutheran pastors as a very helpful, accessible guide to conservative Lutheranism in America. Okay, so that's Francis Pieper. That's how you say his name. It's 4 volume. This is just the first volume, but it's 4 volumes. Okay, last one. This is really 2 volumes from a long series that's been going on for a while. That's been produced by Crossway. Again, Crossway is typically known for evangelical and Reformed, generally Reformed, not specifically Reformed, but evangelical Reformed-ish books. So your typical kind of, loosely affiliated Calvinism, basically. Some of the greats have been published by, Crossway in the, last few decades, such as John Piper and J.I. Packer and others, Leland Ryken, and there's some just great authors that have been published by Crossway. So this is a very reliable, trustworthy source and publisher, and I have found their foundations of evangelical theology just to be gold. Again, it's not Reformed specifically, so there's areas where I feel it needs to be a lot more Reformed. But that, again, it's helpful to know and to have really good resources that kind of go beyond just your tribe. And this series is just so wonderful because it is more traditional in that it argues from the scripture. It builds primarily from there, okay? So it takes into account history, it takes into account philosophy, it takes those things into account, but it kind of adds those things in a little bit later, okay? So you're going to feel a little more comfortable probably with these types of books when you're starting to see, oh, they're not going to philosophy first, they're not going to reason and philosophy, they're not jumping to church history first, they're jumping into the scriptures. And so it's what we would call biblico-systematic. So biblical systematic theology. So it's built from the ground up of the Scripture, okay? So you'll feel probably a little bit more comfortable in what you're used to if you are a conservative, evangelical kind of Christian, okay? John Feinberg is the editor, but he's written the 2 big tomes. And the first that he wrote back in, I think it was 2001 or 2002, I can't remember, was called No One Like Him, The Doctrine of God. And it was really the first volume I read through from cover to cover on the Doctrine of God. And it was very transformative for me in thinking through all the attributes of God, the Trinitarian personality of God, the oneness of God's essence, just the display of his attributes and his perfections, the squabbles over divine sovereignty and human freedom, and then just all the differences of engaging different kinds of theology of our day, feminist theology, process theology, open theism, things like that. So this is a very good book, just very good series, but No One Like Him's a great book. But he also came out with recently Light in a Dark Place. And this is really for an evangelical, to some degree, the most important of all the doctrines, which that's not always a good thing, okay? When you elevate the Bible kind of in the doctrine of Scripture above the doctrine of God, you got to be careful there. But this is the other most important volume in the series. I've actually really loved Against the Darkness. This is a book on Satan and angels. Graham Cole calls the demons Satan's posse. It's really good. It's like it's like Satan's entourage. So it's fascinating. Very, very well put together series. And again, if you're looking for kind of where do you enter into good theology, this is probably a great series for you. You don't need all 8 or 9 volumes, but find a spot where you're interested in and buy that volume and then add to your collection there. But that's a really good spot for most people to enter into. If you're already convinced, Presbyterianism's the truth, man. Like if that's you, definitely get Robert Letham and Robert Dabney. Get some of these Presbyterians that are helpful, very helpful. If you want to know a little bit of the differences between Reformed and Lutheran thinking, get Francis Pieper. He's very accurate in the differences between Lutheran and Reformed thinkers. And if you just want more of a modern take on theology from a Reformed kind of worldview, kind of a broad Reformed thinking instead of Presbyterian, which is more of an English Reformed thought, there are lots of strands of Calvinism and Reformed thinking out there. I really like Christian Dogmatics and Introduction by Vanderkoy and Vandenbrink. Those are really good volumes that really engage with all the modern kind of takes on things, so you can kind of discern what people are saying about those things. So that's my second and final video on systematic theology. I hope you find it helpful. I'm not trying to leave certain traditions out. I'm just trying to tell you what I've personally benefited from the most in this point of my life, and I've been helped by it. There's a lot of other great thinkers out there, but again, I think I put 10 before, and these 6 of those, 16 or 17 have been very helpful for me. So, sign off.